Operation Phase 1 was ordered on November 7, 1941. The combined fleet quickly but unobtrusively broke up and scattered. My destroyer, with its three sister ships of Destroyer Division 16, quietly slipped into the nearby naval port of Kure. I was unaware that major components of the 1st and 2nd Fleet went north to a rendezvous at Hitokapu-wan Tankin Bay in the Kurils to become a part of the greatest Japanese task force ever assembled. Our ships were put through a careful checkup in Kure. Non-essential items were unloaded. Sick crew members were ordered ashore, and they were quickly replaced. Only the commanding officers knew what the operation could possibly develop into. Crewmen were told merely that we were going to the South Pacific on a training cruise. The high command was taking no chances. All leaves and furloughs were cancelled. My last leave had been in September. I had taken a night express train from Kure for the 16-hour ride to my home in Kamakura, a resort town near Yokosuka. But the tiring ride was fully rewarded by the joyous reception I received. My two daughters, who leapt and danced in greeting my return, were joined by my son, Makito, aged 2, who was just beginning to talk. I was able to stay at home only one full day. The children grieved at my leaving, and I shared their feeling. I hugged each of them, saying, "Your daddy will be back soon." The recollection made me want to see them again before the operation, which might deny my ever returning home. Operation Phase 2 was ordered on the 21st of November, 1941. On the following day, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's task force was completely assembled in the fog-shrouded bay of Itorofu Island, in the Kurils. On November 23, 8 destroyers of Destroyer Divisions 16 and 24 slipped quietly out of the Kure harbor and moved toward Terashima Strait, a familiar training area in northern Kyushu. For 4 consecutive days, we fused and prepared all shells and torpedoes in our ships. Doctors were kept busy administering various shots to the crews. Our 2-division squadron moved out of the strait and headed for the Pacific Ocean at 6 on November 26. At the same time, Nagumo's task force sortied from Tankin Bay headed for Hawaii. Our immediate destination was Palau, in Japan's mandated South Sea Islands. All commanding officers were notified to form a small task force at Palau for attacks on Mindanao Island in the Philippines, simultaneous with the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the 2,000-mile cruise from Terashima, our radio transmitters were sealed, as were those of the Nagumo task force. But radiomen were working around the clock on their receivers. As our ships departed from homeland waters, there was a radio message, press reports U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull on the 26th of November handed Japanese ambassadors Kichizaburo Nomura and Saburo Kurusu a note, apparently outlining final U.S. stand on negotiations. As we were passing Formosa on November 28, we picked up a message from the local headquarters. 2 submarines of undetermined nationality, but presumably United States, observed moving northward in waters east of Formosa. Operation Phase 2 authorized commanding officers to take hostile actions only in absolute necessity. I clenched my fists and spoke on the intercom to my sonar officer, "Alert, alert. Possibly hostile submarines reported operating nearby." A professionally cool reply came through, "Roger, roger. All sonar gear functioning properly. We'll let you know if anything is picked up." On December 1, our radio picked up this message: British naval force of 5 warships, including battleship Prince of Wales, is now speeding to the Far East. All the tense atmosphere ended when the green Palau Island emerged on the horizon. We entered its port at 1 the same day. The climate had changed from winter to summer in 5 days. Green coconut trees on the beach were soothing and restful. But my relaxation was short-lived. The atmosphere in Palau harbor was tense. There were scores of vessels at anchor, including many transports. Soldiers were going through drills, climbing up and down rope ladders on their ships. War appeared close at hand. As I stood on the bridge, my first inclination was to set rigid watches. After a while, however, I decided that was pointless and ordered the ship's door open for the crew. Everyone was also directed to take a bath the first since we had left Kure a week before. At the first chance I took a dozen of my ship's officers to make a study of the harbor topography. Actually, I planned this little excursion as a chance for my boys to relax. We toured the harbor leisurely by boat and had a chance to take it easy for a full day and night. In the evening of the following day, December 2nd, we received a historic radio message from Combined Fleet Headquarters. Nitaka Yama no board 1208. Literally translated, it meant, climb MT. Nitaka, the highest mountain in Formosa 1208. I gulped at reading this message, and felt its significance even before opening the sealed secret cipher book. The words meant, start war against the Allies the 8th of December. Shortly afterward all his ship captains were gathered around Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka for instructions on the Davao attack. In his short briefing, Tanaka repeatedly cautioned, remember that negotiations are still being carried on in Washington. We must be prepared at any moment to receive a message calling off the whole operation, if negotiations turn out to be successful. Then we do only one thing: turn around and return to Japan. I spoke up. Here at Palau we are only 500 miles east of Davao, a key American naval base in the Philippines, and 700 miles southwest of another important American naval base at Guam. With so many of our warships assembled here, there must be a number of American submarines keeping watch against us. What should we do in case we contact unfriendly submarines from now on? Tanaka replied. We shall have to sink them, even though Phase 2 authorized us to take hostile acts only out of absolute necessity. With that the meeting broke up, and each commanding officer returned to his ship, affecting an air of composure. Actually it was not difficult to maintain a poker face under the circumstances. I was still skeptical of the wisdom of fighting the Allies, and everything about the plan seemed unreal. I felt, or perhaps wishfully thought, that the operation would be called off at the last moment. An inner voice repeated the words of Sun Tzu, a truly great commander wins without fighting. I had no inkling that the Imperial High Command had concluded on December 1 that the whole note was an ultimatum demanding Japanese capitulation without fighting, and had decided to go to war against the United States and its allies. For 3 days, December 3-5, we conducted rigid around-the-clock maneuvers within the harbor. In a final examination of shipboard conditions all non-essential items were removed. On December 6, at 0130, our 6 destroyers and 1 cruiser steamed out of the spacious harbor at Palau. Our mission was to clear the waters of hostile submarines, paving the way for the carrier and 2 heavy cruisers to sail to Mindanao. Many transports standing by in the toll harbor were scheduled for other parts of the Philippines and also the Dutch East Indies. We steered out of the narrow cut in the western part of the atoll and immediately combed the waters with sonar gear. There was nothing untoward until around 1,600 hours the first day out when the sonar officer reported an alert. What appears to be a submarine, bearing 60 degrees to starboard, distant 2,500 meters. I turned the ship in the indicated direction and barked orders, prepare to release depth charges. Simultaneously the ship sounded a long whistle. Signal flags ABX we are attacking with depth charges were hoisted to let my companion ships know of our action. The sonar officer spoke again. 10 degrees to starboard, 2,000 meters. Sound indicates submarine certain. I adjusted Amatsukaze's heading accordingly and proceeded at 12 knots. Looking around I saw that my men were ready for action at the depth charge launchers, awaiting my next order. The sonar officer continued to report angles and distances, as we closed on the target. I was tense with the excitement of a hunter approaching his quarry, but calm with thoughts of myriad details that had to be considered. As we came within striking distance I realized it was now or never and almost shouted, "Boost speed to 21 knots." Depth charges must be dropped only after a destroyer has boosted its speed, otherwise it will be damaged by its own weapons. But at the last instant I made my decision and swallowed the words. Instead I shouted, "Depth charge action cancelled." Depth charge action cancelled. It was one of the most important decisions I made during the war. My act on that day may be hard to understand for Western readers who may feel that I disobeyed orders in not carrying out the attack. My decision was based on the following reasoning. The 0 hour was set for December 8, 2 days hence. It was not warranted to attack a submarine on the high seas before it showed any hostility to us. At the first word of the sonar detection of the submarine, I became involved in a mental struggle. My concern for peace was great. My first thought was whether my present action might wreck the chance for peace. In addition to that lofty consideration, I was also concerned with the tactical situation at the moment. A successful depth charge attack is not easy, particularly when the opponent is expecting it. If the target should escape, the outcome would be quite disagreeable. The submarine would radio its headquarters and every United States warship would be alerted for the next encounter. When one wavers like that in making a decision, I knew from maneuvers and practice experience, it is doubly hard to score a hit. So I called off the attack. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka was watching me from his cruiser Jintsu, 5,950 tons. He has never questioned me about my queer behavior of that day. Perhaps he understood and shared my feelings. After giving up the chase of the submarine, I turned around and joined the other ships. Presently we were joined by the carrier Ryujo, with 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers out of Palau. The 12-ship task force assembled in a ring formation, boosted speed to 18 knots, headed straight to the west. We were soon out on the wide ocean, out of sight of all land, and even of other ships. From time to time a school of dolphins would catch the eye, but aside from them there was only sea and sky. At the first opportunity I ordered my crew to assemble on deck and apprised them of our destination and mission. Their calm reaction at hearing this news was a surprise to me. Evidently they had already sensed the momentous nature of our orders from the extraordinary training and caution that had preceded our sortie. The officers and men returned to their posts. I sat on the bridge and pored over charts of Davao and its environs. The ship was quiet, the ocean calm. Darkness came and all was peaceful. Our ring formation steamed on observing full blackout precautions. Captain Hara. A radio message. I turned toward the courier. Seaman 2nd Class Takeo Murata had been on board only a month, having come as one of several replacements. The 17-year-old sailor saluted me and stood at attention. I said, "Thanks, Murata," and unfolded the paper he handed me. I felt excitement at the thought that this might be an order countermanding the war operations. It was only an intelligence report. 1 Bristol-class seaplane tender and 1 destroyer anchored in Davao Harbor at 1800 hours the 6th of December. I sighed and resumed the still watch on the dark ocean. Commander Hara. A radio message. Murata was at my side again, sweat dripping from his youthful face. He must have run from the radio room. Good boy. Suddenly I felt sorry for this lad who was sharing the destiny of war with full-grown men. The new message read, "No enemy ship in sight at Legaspi at 1900 hours, the 6th of December. The next messages received were 2 press reports. Ambassadors Nomura and Kurusu have resumed talks with Secretary of State Hull and President Roosevelt regarding the latest American proposal, and Foreign Office spokesman said today that passenger ship Tatsuda Maru, which left Yokohama last week for Los Angeles, was instructed to visit Mexico. It is now scheduled to arrive Los Angeles the 14th of December, depart on the 16th, and arrive at Manzanillo on the 19th. These items certainly implied nothing of a war move. Who could have discerned in these messages that Tatsuda Maru would be ordered to turn around for Japan 30 hours later? The following day, December 7th, passed in similar vein. The tense but monotonous voyage was punctuated for me only by the arrival of routine messages like those of the preceding night. Our second night on the ocean, my watch showed midnight, and the deadline had arrived with no order countermanding the operation. We were still many miles from the attack launching point 50 miles east of Cape San Agustin and 100 miles east of Davao. Suddenly I felt the strain of 2 days and nights on the bridge and dozed off in my chair, leaving Lieutenant Toshio Koyama, my young but capable chief navigator, in command. Cool drops awakened me when our formation stabbed into a blinding rain squall on the dark ocean. It was 03:30 of D-Day, December 8, 1941. How stupid to be napping on such an important day. I cursed myself and phoned the radio room for any new messages. There were none. The squall had passed, but I could not shake off my drowsiness. It was awkward and irritating to be so drowsy that I could not concentrate on the war that was about to break. At daybreak 20 light bombers and fighters were launched from carrier Ryujo, then 50 miles cast of San Agustin and 100 miles from Davao. The sight of these planes had a rousing and inspiring effect on me. While I still lacked any feeling of enthusiasm for the imminent war, I now stood on the bridge of Amatsukaze as a professional, grimly determined to carry out orders. With the departure of Ryuho's planes, destroyers Hayashio, Natsushio, Kuroshio, and Oyashio broke from our ring formation and dashed forward in column formation at 30 knots for a coordinated attack on American forces in Davao Bay. The other 8 ships fell into line formation, 1,500 meters between each ship, and steamed alternately east and west in this unusual formation, awaiting the return of Ryuho's planes. Ryujo was the only aircraft carrier used in the Philippine operation. It had originally been planned to use her, together with 2 converted carriers, in the attack on Luzon. But their plane carrying capacity was so limited that it was decided to strike at Luzon with land-based planes from Formosa and use the carriers elsewhere. Ryujo thus moved to Palau and the 2 slower carriers were sent back to Japan in a last-minute change of schedule. The sun shone intermittently, through occasional breaks in the clouds. There was practically no breeze, and we sweated out 4.5 hours on the ocean in our monotonous back and forth, marking time movement. 19 of the planes returned to Ryujo at 0930. The 20th, a bomber, had to be ditched because of engine trouble. We learned later that the crew was rescued by destroyer Kuroshio. The task force attack on Davao was a complete flop. Our planes and destroyers hit an empty bag. The 2 American warships reported there had vanished before our arrival. There was no air or ground opposition to our forces. Our planes strafed and set on fire only 2 American seaplanes which appeared to have been abandoned in the bay. The planes circled over Davao more than 2 hours. Not a single plane arose from the Davao airfield, or from any other base. It was a most peculiar operation. The attitude of American military forces in Davao that day still remains a mystery. Whatever their judgment, they must have notified their headquarters of our onslaught. Yet Manila headquarters sat idle and kept all planes parked on Clark Field when our Formosa-based planes attacked some 4 hours after we had withdrawn from the Davao area. Meanwhile, cruiser Jintsu, with destroyers Hatsukaze and my Amatsukaze, broke away from the task force formation and headed toward the mouth of Davao Bay to join the 4 destroyers returning from their fruitless sortie. The rendezvous was completed at 1400. I was astounded by the endless volume of radio reports of our brilliant exploits at Pearl Harbor and Clark Field. None of it seemed entirely real. I was brought to sudden reality, however, by the appearance of a B-24 bomber. It flew at about 30,000 feet and seemed to have spotted our ships. Admiral Tanaka decided to make a feint, before rejoining Ryujo, to prevent discovery of our carrier by the American bomber. We made a 180-degree turn and cruised at 18 knots for 1 hour, then turned 90 degrees and ran at 21 knots, before switching 60 degrees again to rejoin Ryujo. The B-24 kept rambling overhead without trying to attack, and finally gave up shadowing our ships before we turned toward our original position. This bomber was another mystery to us. Where it came from and what it was supposed to be doing has never been figured out. By the time we got back to the point 50 miles east of San Agustin, new orders came for me and the skipper of destroyer Hatsukaze. Accordingly, we raced toward Legaspi to join the cruisers Myoko and Nachi, which had gone ahead. The carrier and 2 escorting destroyers had already left for Palau. Admiral Tanaka's flagship Jintsu and the 4 other destroyers followed. I stayed for a week in Legaspi waters, on patrol against American submarines and surface ships carrying possible reinforcements. None appeared, so the duty was boring. But we all knew the importance of safeguarding this rear area in support of the main Japanese landing operation in Luzon. The only excitement I had during the assignment was the 24 hours starting at 1710 on December 9, when my radioman monitored a message from submarine I-65 reporting the discovery of 2 British warships which were racing toward the Japanese landing convoy in Malaya. Thereafter, the radio brought a steady stream of reports about the Japanese attack against the British battleship Prince of Wales and cruiser Repulse. Sweat streamed down my face as I read message after message about this action some 1,000 miles away. My immediate feeling about this distant action was complex. It was a mixture of awe and admiration of the British Navy for its quick deployment. Also, I was suddenly full of enthusiasm for battle and a desire to engage the enemy. But these thoughts of participating in the current battle were purely wishful because I had my own assignment where I was. When the first reports came in concerning action against the British ships, I was greatly concerned. There were only 2 Japanese cruiser battleships in Malayan waters at the time. They were Haruna and Kirishima, both 27,500 tons. Built in 1912 and 1913, they were the oldest warships in service in the Imperial Navy. I did not think they would be any match for Britain's unsinkable Prince of Wales and the combat-seasoned Repulse. The flood of early messages from the vicinity of Malaya was bewildering and disturbing. Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto, Commander Destroyer Squadron 3, reported that it would be difficult for his ships to make early contact with the British force. Submarine I-65 reported at 0430 on the 10th that it had lost sight of the British force because of rain squalls. Then radio signals began to jam each other and no intelligible broadcasts came through to us. It was curious that not a single American warship would come out to fight us in the Philippines. But the British Navy was now driving us panicky all over the area. Atmospherics suddenly cleared at 1400, and we picked up this message: no aerial escorts observed above the British force. Many more messages started coming in rapid succession. 22nd Air Squadron bombs enemy battleship at 1420. Enemy battleship torpedoed at 1430. Aerial torpedo hit direct on enemy cruiser 1440. It now lists heavily to port. One of 5 enemy destroyers set afire. One enemy battleship exploded and is sinking at 1450. Now I was bewildered. Unbelievable things were happening. Japanese airplanes alone had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor never really impressed me as a measure of air strength because the enemy was taken unaware. As a destroyer specialist, my perspective was undoubtedly narrow. But the victory against the British in Malaya really shocked me. I had never considered airplanes to be so powerful. My obstinacy was such that, even after the spectacular Malayan battle, I could not change my perspective. My confidence had been shaken, but I still believed that, since planes were hampered by weather, surface ships must still play a vital role, especially in all-weather battles. Thus, while I was forced to the realization that planes were certain to play an ever-increasing part in warfare, I clung stubbornly to the importance of my own field of interest and endeavor destroyers. It may well be that this very stubbornness, by maintaining my confidence in destroyers, increased my skill and enabled me to score the successes I did in the Pacific War and still survive so many savage battles. I considered at length the British loss of that battleship and cruiser to aerial attack. But I could not possibly envisage that 3 years and 4 months later Japan would be suffering a parallel loss, and that I would be in command of the Japanese cruiser. On December 15 the High Command, satisfied with the smooth progress of landing operations at Luzon, no longer deemed it necessary to patrol Legaspi waters, and ordered our ships back to Palau. An American counter-offensive in the Philippines was written off at that time. While refueling at Palau, further orders arrived for us to escort landing vessels to Davao. At 0700 on December 17, a convoy of 12 transports laden with an army regiment steamed out of Palau in 3 echelons. 7 destroyers and 2 small patrol vessels served as escort. The operation was commanded by Admiral Tanaka in cruiser Jintsu. 45 minutes after leaving Palau, I was standing on the bridge of Amatsukaze when my sonarman reported a submarine just 2,000 meters distant, bearing 80 degrees to starboard. This was almost an exact repetition of what had happened on X day. This time there was no hesitation. We closed to 1,000 meters, boosted speed to 21 knots, threw overboard 6 depth charges, then, turning 230 degrees, we dropped another 6. The charges were set to explode at 30 meters. We observed no indication on the surface of the effectiveness of our efforts. I resumed the escort position at the right wing in front of the second echelon of 4 transports, and the convoy zigzagged on at 10 knots. We consider the submarine sunk. This message was dismal news for us in Amatsukaze. I silently showed it to my officers. They groaned in disappointment. On December 20 before daybreak, the convoy entered the quiet of Davao Bay without challenge from a single plane or ship. A landing operation was not new to me. My experience at Shanghai 5 years earlier had initiated me in enemy gunfire. Our orders at Davao were to hold fire unless challenged. We wanted to occupy the place intact, with a minimum of destruction. 2 echelons had already landed successfully farther down the bay. The escort ships moved slowly into the port, which appeared quiet and peaceful. A platoon of my men shoved off from Amatsukaze in a small motorboat with the assignment of disarming and capturing small vessels at anchor in the port. Within minutes, some 200 troops suddenly emerged on the pier and opened fire on my men in the motorboat. A lookout shouted, "Gunfire on boat." Some of our men appeared to be hit. I shouted orders, "Port guns open fire." This was indeed a repetition of the Shanghai landing. A clumsy repetition for which I cursed myself. Our 6 120mm guns rotated and fired. None of the shells hit the enemy, some 2,000 meters away, but they scattered and fled. Second and third salvos followed. The pier was promptly emptied of troops. "Cease fire," I ordered. But the fourth salvo was already on its way. One of the 6 shells hit a small oil tank some 50 meters from the pier, and it burst into flames. The developments in this operation were far from my expectations. I had repeated a series of clumsy mistakes. I was no longer a swell-headed destroyer expert, but a humbled, penitent man, who was also disgusted with himself. The motorboat, meanwhile, returned with 1 dead. The following day I officiated at the funeral of Petty Officer 2C Suneo Hori, the first of my men to fall in the war. The oil tank burned on for 3 days and nights. For a week after the landing, we were kept busy rescuing Japanese residents of the area. Since Davao had the largest Japanese colony in the Philippines, it was too bad that this operation was so many days delayed. Fortunately, only a few had been killed by retreating enemy troops, and we freed from prison camps the Japanese who had been hurriedly rounded up at the start of the war. It was not long before word came of casualties inflicted on other Japanese destroyers. Ships which took part in the Wake Island operation evidently fared worse than we did at Davao. On December 11, destroyer Kasaragi was sunk by U.S. Marine planes based at Wake. Hayate, a teammate of Kasaragi, was sunk the same day at Wake by Marine shore batteries. How could they have been so clumsy? But others were still more clumsy, I learned. Destroyer Shinonome hit a mine and sank at Miri, Borneo. Highly classified reports said it was not determined whether the mine was Dutch or Japanese. I was infuriated to learn that destroyer Sagiri was torpedoed and sunk by a submarine, also off Borneo, on December 24. A cat eaten by a mouse. How could a destroyer be so stupid? It was ascertained later that the successful submarine was the Dutch K-16, destroyer Kuroshio of my own division, flushed with the achievement of sinking an enemy submarine, also managed to lose face. It was caught napping December 23, apparently in the belief that there were no enemy planes around, when suddenly one emerged from out of the sun. This B-17, a flying fortress, came in at low level to drop its bombs, one of which hit the ship and seriously wounded 4 sailors. These stories were never made public. They were buried deep beneath the spectacular Japanese exploits which were given wide publicity. When I learned of the losses, I could not help feeling worried. As has been said, war is a series of mistakes. But Japan could not afford mistakes. My mounting anger at such losses was changing me from the irresolute, wavering skipper of a month before to a new man, fierce and determined. Frustrations continued along with our successes in the early days of the war, and on January 4, 1942, another occurred which was maddening to me. On that day 14 major warships, comprising almost the entire Japanese surface force of the area, lay moored in the small harbor of Malalag on the western coast of Davao Bay. The harbor mouth is quite narrow, and the commanding admiral of the fleet had ordered it closed with an anti-submarine net. I was eating lunch when the lookouts shouted, "Air raid." We looked up and saw 9 land-based 4-engine bombers at 30,000 feet. We knew these were enemy B-17s, flying fortresses, because Japan's only 4-engine bombers at that time were Kawanishi flying boats Emily. Best gear flew in every direction as officers and men scrambled to get to battle stations and into action. But what could we do? With the mouth of the small harbor closed, we were helpless. We could do nothing. Our guns would not reach the plane's altitude, and not a single Japanese fighter plane was airborne. I could only cross my fingers as the bombs came curving down. Fortunately, the American bombers, apparently new arrivals at Java, did not carry heavy bomb loads, and their aim was not good. One 250-pound bomb did score a direct hit on the No. 2 turret of cruiser Myoko in the center of the harbor. More than 20 were killed and 40 others wounded. Splinters of that bomb reached seaplane tender Chitose, moored 500 meters away, and damaged 5 planes on her deck. Not one Japanese plane was able to take off in time to pursue the raiders. My Amatsukaze was so near the beach we could not move an inch to evade the bombs. Luck alone saved us. I had never felt so miserable as on that day when I watched the 12,374-ton Myoko, our teammate since X day, limping out of Davao Bay on its way back to Japan for repairs. We could not afford this kind of stupidity. In January 1942, I took part in the invasion of the Netherlands East Indies, supporting the landing operations at Manado and Kandari. In both landings, there was little opposition from the local garrisons, but the poor quality of our air support was an ill omen for the future. The Japanese Navy did not have enough planes to cover our landings, and the few planes we saw were manned by second-rate flyers. Without proper training, they reported ghost ships that did not exist, bombed whales that they mistook for submarines, and even shot down our own transport planes in the confusion of air battles. My own experience in hunting submarines had been no more satisfying. On the night of January 31st, while escorting transports to a landing at Bill Bay on Ambon Island, I caught a submarine on the surface with my searchlight. We failed to hit with 3 salvos, and it got away. Regretfully, I signaled our failure to the other ships, warning that the enemy had probably escaped unscathed and might come back. I sweated out the next 2 hours. The enemy sub might choose our slow troop-laden transports as easy targets.